Hello, everyone. My name is Antoni Pizà. I'm a musicologist and a writer. I'm currently the director of the Foundation for Iberian Music in New York and a member of the doctoral faculty in music at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Daniel Jordan, musicologist and research fellow at the University of Toronto. Dr. Jordan's research focuses on music and Cold War politics. He received his PhD in music from the University of Cambridge and the Masters of Music in Piano Performance with distinction from the Royal College of Music, London. Dr. Jordan has recently published Coros y Danzas, Folk Music and Spanish Nationalism in Early Franco Regime, this wonderful book that I have here in my hands. This is a sweeping examination of the uses of music as a soft power and cultural diplomacy by the Franco regime in Spain from 1939 to 1953. Daniel, it is such an honor to speak with you once again about this issue.
Well, thank you so much, Antoni, for inviting me and for reading the book and for arranging this talk between us.
Fantastic. It's quite a privilege. Tell me, what were the Coros y Danzas of Spain during the first 2 decades of the Franco regime, roughly from 1935 to 1953? This is the topic, of course, Coros y Danzas of your book. So what were the Coros y Danzas?
Sure. Well, the Coros y Danzas, or in English we would say choruses and dances, were ensembles created by the Sección Femenina, the women's section of Spain's fascist Falange party. So the Coros y Danzas, the Sección Femenina, because that's the context here, was founded during the liberal Second Republic in 1934 by Pilar Primo de Rivera, daughter of the ousted dictator from the 1920s, Miguel Primo de Rivera, and also the sister of the founder of the Falange, José Antonio Primo de Rivera. So the Sección Femenina was initially a reactionary movement against the emancipation that women gained during the Second Republic. For example, women's right to vote, legalized divorce, and their greater inclusion in the workforce. Falangists saw professionally liberated women as being susceptible to sexual immorality and being contaminated by foreign cosmopolitan popular culture. At least this is what they said. The Sección Femenina was designed to reintroduce ideas of Catholic values to Spanish women in their traditional roles as mothers and homemakers. However, as Spain drew closer to the Civil War, the nationalist army, led by Franco, relied increasingly on the Sección Femenina as nurses, factory workers, propagandists, and also as spies and partially soldiers. So although José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the founder of the Falange, who I mentioned previously, was executed by the Republican Army at the start of the Civil War, his sister, Pilar Primo de Rivera, survived to continue directing the Sección Femenina until it was disbanded in 1977. That's 2 years after the death of Franco, right?
Yeah, very recently.
Yeah. So during the 1950s, the Sección Femenina had about 30,000 members, so it was a huge organization. And later this increased in the following decades to around 50,000. And so the whole concept here is that the Franco regime, including the Sección Femenina, designated women as the caretakers of the nation's music. So along with running the escuelas de hogar, or the schools for home economics and so on, for example, the Sección Femenina also had a department of music through which it ran courses on dance ensembles, music theory, composition, ear training, and of course the ensembles called the Coros y Danzas, who specialized in religious and rural music traditions. So in my book, I show that the Sección Femenina altered Spain's diverse rural music traditions, which it referred to as música folclórica, or musical folklore, transmitting its idealized vision of Spanish rural life at home and also abroad to places like the United States, for example. The instructoras de música, the female music instructors of the Sección Femenina, acted as informants who determined the cultural purity of the nation's regional ethnic communities. And this department of music of the Sección Femenina attempted to save Spanish music from the supposed corruption of republicanism, as I said before, cosmopolitanism, and what they consider to be the trivial forms of American popular entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. Thank you. And one of the things that you mention in the book is that, okay, so there was the Sección Femenina, the women's group, you know, with 30, as you say, at one point, more than 30,000 members. And then that group had a kind of a subgroup, if I might say that, which was the instructoras, you know, so the music instructors in this particular case. And those instructoras, they were supposed to compile and then even compose, and in some cases harmonize, meaning setting chord progressions to folk tunes, and a few other, and transcribe, of course, compile, transcribe, etc., folk music. Now, one of the main points of your book is that in the process of compiling, transcribing, harmonizing, orchestrating maybe, and printing maybe this music, there was a high degree of manipulation, okay, of the folk, that what you see is, or what you hear what you could hear when you heard the Coros y Danzas was not exactly the oral and rural traditions of Spain. So the Sección Femenina and the Coros y Danzas and those instructoras, they were involved in fairly sophisticated system of manipulation oral traditions of Spain. So that's the basic idea, the way I understand it. But can you provide maybe some specific examples of that, how some tunes or dances, they were manipulated? And then before you answer, I'll say that when you transcribe any kind of oral tradition, just by the fact of transcribing, you know, you're already eliminating so many microtones and irregular rhythms and things like that. But besides doing that many transcribers actually do it, you know, what else were the instructoras doing?
Right, so now we have this kind of fundamental question that I think ethnographers and ethnomusicologists and musicologists are always asking themselves is about questioning the nature of the invention of tradition, right? So, exactly. I mean, it's all very well for me to say that, you know, such and such an ensemble somewhere changed music traditions, but if they're going to be performing them, it's already going to be changed in every single performance, right? I mean, that's the idea. That being said, this was a particular case where the informants, the music instructors, were consciously changing performance practices as well as the music itself to suit a particular end. So we have, in every province of Spain, we have about 2 or 3 music instructoras, female music instructors, and they would go out into the countryside and they would collect music traditions, musical dances, or dances rather, and songs, right? Often this would be done during a traditional festival, or perhaps during a harvest of olives or almonds, etc., where you would expect to hear certain songs or dances. And then they would transcribe them onto musical notation on these song files. They also had separate dance files and also separate files for traditional dress, for traditional clothing, right? And on each one of these files for the songs in particular, they not only wrote down the melodies onto standard Western staff notation, which, as you said, would perhaps take out the details that might have been there with microtones or the more flexible meters and whatnot. They also changed words, particularly when the words may have been rude, or left out those verses. And also they had on these files, these standardized files coming from Madrid, right? They would have the categories for the history of the song, which sometimes would be made up, sometimes it would come from the histories of previous Spanish nationalists from the 19th century. And then they would also invent the harmonization, sometimes in somewhat sophisticated counterpoint, to do with 3 or 4 voices, right? And also on top of this, they would have local composers write instrumental accompaniments for usually traditional instruments, and sometimes even for piano. And on top of this, then sometimes I found many songs and dances that were not actually being danced at the time. I also found many costumes that were not actually being worn at the time. But for example, they would go to a doll museum in Cádiz, and that still exists today. And they would look at these dolls from the 19th century or the 18th century, and they would copy the dresses, what seemed to be traditional dresses from that region. Or, for example, there's an instance when the instructora got access to a book of song collections, a songbook that had been compiled by an organist in Granada earlier in the 20th century, in the early 19th century, and began to copy those out and harmonize them, and then have her ensemble of Coros y Danzas of Granada, the local ensemble, performance, even though these had not been performed for a very long time, right? So it's all of these layers. So
many layers. That's the word, I think.
Layers, yeah. So coming back, yes, I mean, of course, traditions must always be changed and invented because that's the nature of performance, but then there's also this very real history that has to be taken into consideration as well.
But I wanted to add and ask you that, for example, when the songs were in Catalan or in Basque or Galician Portuguese, the original language was kept. It was not changed. One would imagine maybe that just for given given the nationalistic slant of the Franco regime, that they would have said, oh no, just translate these into a Castilian Spanish, forget about Basque or Catalan or Galician. But actually, those songs, they were kept in the lyrics of some songs, if they were in Catalan or any other minority language, they were kept in their original language. How could they allow that, or how could they justify not, since it was an authoritarian regime, why did not go all the way there? Because we know that those languages were repressed.
Yes, they were repressed, and so here we come to another big point that I make in my book that is fairly universal for when you're studying the culture or even just the broader policies of any totalitarian regime, is that any dictatorship, whether we're talking about the quasi-fascist Franco regime or the Soviet Union, whatever, you're dealing with millions of people, right? And including millions of people who are actually working supposedly on behalf of the state. And each individual may claim that they are interpreting correctly the policies from above, but in fact, once you get down into the local level of Cadiz or some village in the Basque Country, they may have very different ideas of what Franco is saying or what Pilar Primo de Rivera is saying in Madrid, right? So going on with that, the policy for either repressing or incorporating the Basque or the Catalan or the Aragonese languages was not consistent at all, or Gallego, and so on and so on. And so one method, and the method that seems to have been taken in the Sección Femenina and in the Department of Music, was to folklorize the languages to make them antiquated. That's one way of looking at it. And by performing them in Catalan, for instance, but showing it as a language that is historical rather than currently in use.
Atavistic, anachronic.
Yes, yes. And I think there's still a lot more work that can be done on the Franco regime's relationship with regional languages and regional cultures,
Yes.
because it is very contradictory.
Yeah. And you just mentioned that one of the big points of your book, I think that you would agree, is that totalitarian regimes as not as total as they would like to be, probably. And there is all these competing strategies and policies and different interests among different groups that sometimes are contradictory. One of them is that, as we just mentioned, is what to do with folk songs that were in minority languages in Spain, right? Another kind of contradictory policy, maybe you could cover that, was that I had the impression reading your book that the Sección Femenina wanted to promote national Catholic values, or the values of national Catholicism on the one hand, and conservative values and traditional family and traditional roles for women as spouses, as wives, as mothers. But at the same time, and that's one of the little contradictions, a lot of the women who were members, or some of the women who were member of the Sección Femenina and also of the Coros y Danzas, they were empowered by those roles. So that's a kind of a contradiction, I think. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that, right? So the Sección Femenina, on the one hand, was repressive, but at the same time, for the happy few, at least, it was kind of giving power to a lot of women. And you mentioned that some women, when they went on tour, actually suffered the indignities that any other woman has to suffer sometimes, namely sexual harassment and pressure to be sexual or things like that, you know. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, this double role of the Sección Femenina as repressive and also, for a few at least, empowering.
Yeah. So in the last chapter of the book, I also discuss, for example, the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic.
Yes.
And they also had their Sección Femenina that was actually older than the one in Spain, right? And the two groups were actually collaborating across the Atlantic. And in comparing these two organizations, we see that there's this paradox in any patriarchy, which is actually a term that I borrowed from another scholar in the book who was focusing on the Dominican Republic, where you have this kind of umbrella rhetoric of the man being the one in charge of the household and also the one in charge of the state, right? But then there's this problem that often arises, such as in Spain and in the Dominican Republic, is that the women have to have some means of communicating to other women what their role is supposed to be. See? So, and the only way to do that often is to get women to take on that role. And the only way to get women to take on that role is to give them some kind of power, right? And so we see the Sección Femenina in Spain taking on the role of for spies during the Civil War, but then also as nurses, as organizing. They take the castle of La Mota, which was once one of the residencies of Isabel the Catholic, one of the Catholic monarchs who famously conquered the last Islamic kingdom of Iberia, and using this castle as their residency, and framing Isabel the Catholic as their kind of almost patron saint, as a woman, utilizing the structure of the Catholic Church to empower themselves and promote this idea of femininity. Mm-hmm. So you're right, it is contradictory, and oddly enough, we find many of the women in the Franco regime via the Sección Femenina gaining in some ways more power than men, at least some men, at their own social strata. Now, of course, as you mentioned, then we also find once they go abroad, they're having to conflict and bump up against the local male diplomats in London or in New York City. And then these tensions arise. And then, of course, we go back to the theme of a totalitarian regime not exactly being so monolithic as they present themselves as being.
Yeah. And on this note of contradictions within totalitarian regimes, and specifically the Franco regime, you also mentioned that the Sección Femenina and the Falange and the Coros y Danzas, they presented contradictory, we could say that, incongruent, definitely, versions of Spanish nationalism. One, on the one hand, as extremely Christian, as they used to say, old Christian, Cristiano Viejo, without any contamination, quote unquote, from Muslim and Jewish blood or anything like that. On the one hand. On the other hand, the Coros y Danzas, they toured Morocco in a kind of colonial last day adventure of Spain in northern Morocco, the protectorate of Morocco, which was administered by Spain. And when they visit Morocco, they were playing the other card, the opposite of the card, which is playing up the brotherhood, so to speak, between Spain and Northern Africa and Muslim Northern Africa, because of the influence, the Islamic influence of Muslims in Spain. So that was another contradiction, right? So I guess.
Yeah. So we have the as early as in the 19th century, we have this history of some Spanish scholars, sometimes nationalists, sometimes what we might call liberal or democratic, drawing upon various narratives of what we call Al-Andalus, is the period of time when, or the place of the Muslim kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. This includes Garcia Lorca, the poet, Blas Infante, who was as well as being a writer and musician, he was also a pro-Andalusian nationalist who wanted a certain degree of autonomy for the province earlier in the 20th century. And then on top of that, we have, once the Spanish Civil War comes, the nationalists, led by Franco, are actually basing themselves in the protectorates in Morocco, right? And they're utilizing about 80,000 Muslim soldiers from the protectorates, while they were also promoting this idea that Spain, the motherland, was being contaminated by foreign leftist Bolsheviks, right? And utilizing the narrative of national Catholicism, or Spaniards being defined by religion, by this particular brand of Catholicism. So even on the left and the right, we have these contradictions. And then in the Spanish Civil War, the Garcia Lorca, who promoted this idea of Al-Andalus, is murdered. So is Blas Infante. But then, oddly enough, the nationalists, the Sección Femenina, in the 1940s and 50s, began to appropriate these narratives of Garcia Lorca and Blas Infante, and actually refer to them in their song cards that I mentioned before, right? And so then in Andalusia, they promote this idea of convivencia, or the brotherhood of the Muslims and the Christians. The Jews are sort of forgotten a little bit, and then in Castile, in central Spain, it's more of the theme of the Catholic monarchs and Isabel and Ferdinand, who conquered and repurified the Iberian Peninsula from what was proposed as the invading, contaminating hordes from the south, from North Africa. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then, of course, the narrative in Andalusia becomes useful for cultural diplomacy within North Africa, particularly within the Spanish protectorates, and also the Tangier international zone, where the Spaniards could also communicate with Americans and people from the UK and people from France, and also when the Coros y Danzas visited the French protectorates, such as Casablanca, for example. Yes.
So the Coros y Danzas, you just mentioned the Americans, and the Coros y Danzas really served a very important purpose, basically, of presenting Spain as a country less and less and less fascist, and more pro-Western and pro-democracy. Whether or not that was true, the democracy, yeah, that's a different question. But at least they were trying to present that image that with the Coros y Danzas, which was an ensemble, or different ensembles rather, you know, and sending them to Morocco, sending them to the United States, as they did, England, also other countries in Europe. You know, basically the Spanish state machinery was trying to say, we're not the pro-Mussolini and pro-Hitler that we were a decade ago, and we are more pro-American and pro the Allies, Britain and France, etc. So that basically they accomplished that mission. I mean, I don't know if they accomplished it, but at least they were part of that mission, right? Because your book basically covers from 1939, which is the end of the Spanish Civil War, which was in which Francisco Franco was victorious, until 1953. Why 1953?
Yes, so we have the Pact of Madrid, and we also have what was called the Marshall Plan. And so, I mean, if we're going to say that Spain was, the Franco regime was victorious in its diplomacy as a whole, those would be the markers of its victory. So, as you said, Franco, during the Spanish Civil War, he was assisted, you know, famously in Guernica, by Nazi Germany and by fascist Italy, and was sort of hedging his bets a little bit, and with more focus that the fascists the Axis would probably win the Second World War when it came around. Around 1943, October, perhaps, things didn't look quite so positive for the Axis anymore. And he began to allow the Americans to use ports and air bases within Spain, which were very strategic for them to defeat Nazi Germany. And when 1945 comes around and the Axis is defeated, he's in a very tough situation, because he, even though the fascist Falange party is not sort of subsumed into the interior of the state, it wasn't a one-party state by any means. It was also with monarchists and all sorts of Catholic nationalists. The presence of the Falange and the Section Femenina, which was the women's section of the Falange, right? So they are unambiguously fascists, right? With a capital F. Yeah. This is problematic. So we have these angry Americans, some of them who were in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who tried to help fight against the fascists during the Spanish Civil War. We also have many veterans from the Second World War who fought against Nazi Germany, who need some sort of explanation as to why the Western democracies are not invading what is a nationalist or pro-fascist state. there was much discussion that this ought to happen, that the United States ought to invade and overthrow the Franco regime after 1945.
Mhm.
What became beneficial was the Cold War for the Franco regime, and that it became more useful to forget, for the Americans and for Western Europe, to forget the fascist past of the Franco regime and rather use it as a kind of ally and have its base to create the supposedly try and help defend the West from communists, well, from the Soviet Union and from the
Yes.
communist Eastern. Yes.
Yeah. And the Falange, to my knowledge, it doesn't exist anymore. Although I'm not, to say absolutely the truth, I don't know if it exists. There might be, but I don't think it exists. And Sección Femenina doesn't exist. And you also mentioned the Frente de Juventudes, the Youth Front, which was a male counterpart of Sección Femenina, doesn't exist anymore. However, the Coros y Danzas, it still exists.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're, at the end of your book, you're wondering about the persistence and the kind of and the reason why the Coros y Danzas still exist. Do they exist? Do they have a? Are they useful? What do they do? What is their political ideology? Have them relinquished the contemporary members, the current members of the Coros y Danzas? Have they abandoned their historical roots?
No, so the Coros y Danzas still exists. In many cases, I know that they are still directed and organized by women who had been members of the Sección Femenina, including instructoras. But here we come across, another difficult question, which there's not always going to be a single right answer, is going back to the invention of tradition. What do you do when a state transitions from a totalitarian regime, which had been under for nearly 40 years, and then becomes democratic? What happens to all of the culture that was created during those years? Now, in the case of the contemporary Coros y Danzas, they trace their genealogy to their operations during the Sección Femenina. And they're very proud of that fact. And they even, on their websites, they'll even have the list of awards they had and the list of international tours they had been a part of during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and so on. And so it will perhaps be the question of another scholar, another ethnomusicologist, to begin piece apart what these boundaries are today for the members of the contemporary Coros y Danzas. And that's going to be a very interesting topic, and one I hope to read soon by someone else.
Me too. Well, we're essentially out of time, and I'm very grateful, Daniel, for this conversation, but I'm even more grateful for you having written this book, Coros y Danzas, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. and you've done a wonderful job. Your research is amazing, and I've learned a lot in reading your book. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and also for having written this book. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Antoni, for reading the book, first of all, and also for organizing this talk. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yes.
Have a
Okay.
wonderful day. Thank you.
See you soon. All right.
See you.